Nyajong. Good afternoon. Gulumbeya Gava. My name is Gava, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement and Impact from Minnesota Public Radio. I'm here to welcome you to In Focus, Environmental Justice and Minnesota's Climate Future. As we talk about environmental justice, I want to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. Minnesota is the homeland to the Dakota people who have lived here for thousands of years. Indigenous people from other Indigenous nations also reside in Minnesota and have made innumerable contributions to our region. Indigenous people are still here and they are thriving and contributing to our collective futures. The In Focus series is a part of Minnesota Public Radio's commitment to host conversations that bring awareness, dialogue, and community solutions to Minnesota's persistent racial disparities. We hope these conversations involving community members, shaped by our curious and engaged audience, will encourage new narratives, new relationships, and serve as a catalyst to help Minnesota communities make progress towards equity and inclusion. Our goal is to help all of us to see our sheer humanity and gain a better understanding of what our fellow community members face. Ahead of today's discussion, Minnesota Public Radio hosted 3 story circles with community members from across Minnesota. They shared their personal stories of how environmental injustice has touched them. We're grateful for their time and we're excited to share some of what we learned from them during today's event and as a part of our ongoing community engagement work. We also like to thank our funder, Thomson Reuters, who made this conversation possible. Your thoughts about this conversation are also important to us. If you registered for the event through Zoom, you'll receive a survey from Minnesota Public Radio. If you have a question or personal experience that you'd like to share during the event, use the Q&A button and submit it. We will get to as many questions as time allows. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Twila Dang, who is sitting in for Angela Davis and will host today's conversation. Twila is the founder of Matriarch Digital Media and produces and co hosts Small Change Money Stories from the Neighborhood from Minnesota Public Radio News. Twila, over to you.
Thank you, Ga, and welcome to In Focus, everyone. As Ga said, I'm Twila Dang, and I'm thrilled for you to be here and learn a little bit more about environmental justice in Minnesota with us today. Now, this hour, we're going to talk about how climate change is exacerbating the need for environmental justice. We'll talk about how communities that are disproportionately impacted by pollution are working to change the system. We'll also look at issues that compound the problem, like racial inequalities and even where people live. And of course, we'll take your questions for our panel. Speaking of them, I'm excited to introduce them today. Panelists, please turn your cameras on. Now let's start. Theresa T. McClenty is the brand new executive director of Minnesota 350, an organization that focuses on environmental justice in Minnesota. Before she transitioned to MN 350, she worked in community health in Minneapolis as a nurse and EMT. Welcome to the focus. Welcome to In Focus, T.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Francisco Segovia comes to us from Kopal, a grassroots organization that he started a little more than 4 years ago to address the well-being of Latinx communities in Minnesota. Before Kopal, Francisco served as director of the Waite House Center in South Minneapolis. It's lovely to have you here, Francisco.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have with us Sharon Day. Sharon is an Ojibwe elder and has been the executive director of the Indigenous Peoples Task Force for more than 30 years. Since 2011, she has led numerous water walks alongside America's rivers, offering prayers and blessings for their health. She's also a grandmother, musician, writer, and as you'll discover, a storyteller, something we have in common. We're really glad to have you here, Sharon.
Thank you so much.
And I just want to remind you all that all are welcome to be a part of the conversation. So if you have something you'd like to say to each other, or there's a question you'd like to ask, feel free. And the same goes for our audience. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button, and I will try my best to work them in. So let's get started. T, I want to start with you. How did you personally come to the work of environmental justice?
Hello, everyone. So I came into the work. It's a question that I get asked often because my pathway is healthcare. I worked more than 20 years in the emergency room as an emergency room technician and EMT. So I did the rig and then I did in-house support. And working those years in the emergency room helped me learn how to work with my youngest son who has asthma. And it was kind of weird that he was diagnosed with asthma because no one in the family has asthma, but he had asthma. So the things that I've seen in the emergency room, I would say at that time, I would say that I was thought about climate. But if I was being totally honest, it wasn't on the forefront, more about the disparities that I was seeing in healthcare and communities of color and why they were coming into the emergency room. Those are the things that hit me the most. Then I started doing some community engagement with my work with SEIU Healthcare. And though we were talking about different topics, things that the community was facing, we were out there engaging the community and wanted to learn from the community. And I decided that I wanted to work more in my community. So I started working at a human services organization in North Minneapolis called North Point Health and Wellness Center. And North Point is a powerhouse and they're out there in the community and they are really providing the resources that the community needs and more BIPOC communities. And during that time, we were talking about food insecurity. Climate really kept coming up for me. Climate kept coming up in the issues that we were facing, redlining, air pollution. And at the same time, I continued to think about my own son, who still continues as a young adult deals with asthma. And as a runner, I am happy that I can go out and run, but I understand the air that we breathe is really important. So I started thinking about climate because it's about everything. I talked about health. I talked about community engagement and things that really impact our community. And MN 350 had an opening, and I actually just started there in February as their executive director. And I wanted to get into climate because I want to see more communities that look like me in this space. And when we're thinking about climate and the initiatives and the approaches and the things that we need to do to improve our planet, I just don't see enough people, communities of color, engage in this work. And how information is disseminated to BIPOC communities, I just feel like there are some things that we all can do better. And we're not going to improve our planet and improve our climate if it is a white movement. I believe that it needs to be a human movement and not just one side who's making the plan. So I want to see more communities of color engaged. So that's why I got involved.
Well, I'm excited. Congratulations for the new role, and I'm excited to see what you do in the role.
Thank you. Thank you.
Francisco, similar question. Why is environmental justice one of Kopal's focus areas? I mean, there's a lot of issues that could call for your attention when it comes to empowering Latino communities in Minnesota.
Thank you for the question, and I am honored to be here with you all. That's a good question. It was the organization Kopal is a new organization, so basically we are getting into our 5th year of existence. But Minnesota became home for myself about 33 years ago when I, due to a civil war in my home country, I was displaced and I ended up in Florida first and then Minnesota. Nothing to do with the weather. Even, in fact, knew about the weather in Minnesota, but anyway, Minnesota became home. First places that I went to live was Phillips neighborhood, where I then later did work for many, many years. So when we began Kopal about 4 years ago, a few years later into the build-up of the organization, a foundation approached us and said, hey, do you want to get into the environmental justice or issues? And for a moment we paused and I sit down with my team. We had a process going, and one of the questions that came to us is, how do we contribute into this conversation? So we see the landscape where many organizations are already doing beautiful work. So what is our contribution to this? And then through our own process, we realized that it was key to put some spotlight to the issue of forced migration due to environmental catastrophes. And so we got into that conversation. We first began by facilitating a trip to Central America We had the Attorney General Keith Ellison coming along and a few other elected officials to speak about, to meet people from Honduras, El Salvador, and to talk about why people were leaving homes. If you remember the caravans that we saw 3 years ago or 4 years ago. And so part of the conversation was, what is going on in Central America that forces people to leave? And one of the conversations was about the droughts, issues with changes in the weather patterns, too much rain or not enough rain. And some of those issues were kind of cemented our desire for doing a couple of things. One is to understand why people move. And once people move and come to places like Minnesota, how do we integrate people into our communities? And from the perspective of what is how can they participate in creating a Minnesota that is welcoming for everyone, but also a Minnesota that that welcome people and that they can contribute benefits from a just environment, but also make sure that the environment that we fight for in Minnesota includes our communities, especially those who have been displaced due to climate change. So that was how we got into this, and obviously there will be more to talk about, but that's how Kopal is into this conversation.
So this is really community driven and community connected in the work that you do. That's wonderful. Sharon, let's talk a little bit about how your path intersects with environmental justice.
Well, I think when the task force first began, our focus was on people living with HIV and AIDS. And we knew back then that the environment had a lot to do with health disparities. And so as we expanded our mission in 2000, we included health and wellness. And of course, that includes, in Phillips neighborhood, as people have already said, people in Phillips are impacted by all kinds of environmental issues. There was the arsenic in the soil. There's ongoing air pollution from being bounded by Hiawatha 94 and 35. And so our children are breathing in diesel fumes and car fumes, every single day. And I've worked in this community for 30 years, and also I'm asthmatic. And I can tell you from my personal experience, moving out of the city the last couple of years, my asthma has been much more under control, being outside of this environment every day. And then there's the water. In 1998, we became involved in trying to save the spring, that last free-flowing spring in Minneapolis, Camp Coldwater, and that began all of the work around the water issues.
I was struck by when I was reading a little bit of your bio information, Sharon, about the river walks that you do. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that began too in 1998, thereabouts, when we were trying to save the spring. I am a Medewan woman, which means that the Medewan in English translates to the Grand Medicine Society, and one has to study and become an initiate to become a Medewan. And in 1998, the chief of our lodge said to us, what will you do for the water? And what would happen if all the women of the world stood up and said no more? And of course, when you look around the globe, women, we are the ones who gather the water, right? We're the ones who go in the morning and gather that water, and also at night, and to make sure that you have fresh water first thing in the morning. And so women are also life givers. To this point in our evolution, we are the only ones who can bring life into the world. And of course, that life lives in our womb and in water, and that water purifies itself. And and then we come into the world in a gush of water. And so it's then women's responsibility to take care of the water. And so Josephine Mandamin, Iban, the late Josephine Mandamin, she heard him say that too. And so she got rid of all the toxic cleaning supplies in her home. And then she thought, what else can I do? And and she said water has to move to be healthy. And so she began the first walk around Lake Superior and consequently walked around all 5 Great Lakes. I had the opportunity to walk with her around Lake Superior. And then in 2011, I led the walk from Gulfport, Mississippi to Lake Superior. And on that walk, we brought water from the 4 oceans and you know, that healing salt water to the heart of Turtle Island, which for us is Lake Superior. And then we commingled all of those waters and we put it back into Lake Superior. And I remember 4 days out from Gulfport, Mississippi, Josephine said to me, she said, I had a realization that we've orphaned this water. We took it from its home, and now it's our responsibility to take care of it until we put it into Lake Superior. And then who knows how long it will take that water to get back to its home. But when it does, it will confer with all the other waters and it will tell them that there are still human beings who love and care for the water. And so that's how it began. And, you know, we lost Josephine 2 years ago. But, you know, women in Canada and in the United States, you know, we continue to do that work that she began. And that is praying to the water spirits. You know, we believe that everything has a spirit. And no matter how much money the bankers have or the corporations or all these extractive industries have, they're not more powerful than the water. And so when we carry that water, we're speaking to the spirit of the water. And when we gather it at the headwaters where it's still cleaner, pure, more pure, and we carry it singing and praying every single day, and we put it into the confluence or the mouth of the river or the ocean, we're giving the water a taste of herself. This is how you began, pure and clean, and this is how we wish for you to be again. And so that's the water walks. And
That's
we have
really beautiful.
coming up soon. Thank
That's
you.
it's really, really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us. I wanted everyone to hear it because I even reading it, it struck me so specifically. Um, I wanted we need to sort of talk about the idea that climate change is. I mean, it feels redundant to say, but it's a complex problem. And when it comes to environmental justice, how do we see the complexity of that? Like, how do we see it impacting our direct communities? Francisco, can you talk a little bit about how you see environmental justice impacting the Latinx community?
Yes, but before I want to refer to the beautiful introduction or the words of Sharon and what relates to water. There was a study done in Central America by an organization called Inspire Action about climate migration and the dry corridor of Central America. This is a gender perspective. And some of the study they did, they discovered that women now have to add 6 extra hours to work just to collect water. So in the division of labor in our societies, women have the responsibility of finding the water. So with the issues of water droughts or access to clean water, there is extra work that women have to do just to collect that precious liquid. And so that's obviously reinforces this issue of how to find quality water, drinkable water. Now, in the context of how environmental these issues are impacted their lives. Obviously, if you are in Central America, and if you depend on farming, and also your life depends on getting good water, clean water, that is extra work that is added. And what relates to here in Minnesota, one of the things that we notice when you are an immigrant, you oftentimes you are going to go to live into a community where rent is is less expensive, and but also you are going to be lacking access to healthcare, a good paying job with benefits, and so. But when we speak about environment as multiple factors that impacts the quality of lives, um, we will see that you are going to go to a community that is already stressed due to environment challenges. I'm going to mention and obviously Sharon uh, resides or work in Phillips neighborhood. I used to work at Phillips neighborhood. I used to live in Phillips neighborhood. And Phillips neighborhood is, for instance, one of the examples in our communities, very diverse communities, that is heavily impacted by the various businesses that have traditionally polluted the area. And I studied that I came across 5 years ago from Children's Hospital. Children's Hospital has a is located on Chicago and 26, I believe. The study was telling us that there were about 3,000 kids with asthma in the area of Phillips and Powderhorn. So those are some of the things that you can see how environment is stressing our communities and impacted the well-being of our children and everyone, every single family. Thank you.
I think that's I think you're bringing to the surface a really strong point. I mean, even when we talk about that, when we talk about how those things impact and how we see it particularly coming up in the next generation, T's work intersecting with this because of what happened with her son and presenting asthma in a family where they traditionally don't have it. Our family has the same experience. My youngest child, we have no history of asthma in our family, and my youngest child is asthmatic and carries her inhaler and rescue inhalers. And sometimes I think we get disconnected from the idea that there are other factors at work, not just, oh, you did this thing or this thing while you were pregnant. There could be a lot of other mitigating things, particularly around the environment, that are impacting that. I want to turn back to that a little bit. T, can you talk a little bit about more of the impact of climate change and how you see it show up in your community?
I see the impact of climate change show up in my community. When you think about the history and, of Rondo and the redlining, and that's main traffic, the air pollution right over the freeway. And so I think about air quality and how that has impacted my community. And I also think about health disparities. When you think about Black, Brown communities, we already are setting records. We're already overrepresented and a lot of the disparities. We have the highest disparities in health. We have the highest disparity and so many other things. And when it comes to climate, and I appreciate Francisco talking about it, when you talk about climate and the environmental justice, you think about how are you going to talk to communities who's already having the impacts of climate or dealing with other health issues. They're already dealing with social justice issues. You have the killing of George Floyd and all those different things. And when we're talking about climate, it's important for us to understand what are the things that the community is facing and how can you intersect and talk about, because you can't talk about climate without talking about racial justice. You can't talk about racial justice without talking about climate and social justice. So I think they all go hand in hand. And I see how climate is impacted in my community and communities of color. When you think about education, you think about resources. I remember working at a human services, and we were out talking to people about clean plates, and we was talking about recycling, and some of the initiatives that this climate group was talking to us about. It required them to spend money to do compost and do different things, and so we were talking about, you're talking to a community that's already trying to find out how they're going to pay their energy bill. And now they need to figure out, in order to, have a healthier climate, that they have to spend money. And so I just think there's different ways that we can have solutions to some of these climates, because it impacts communities of color the most.
I want to talk about how folks in your communities, are fighting for environmental justice. What do the movements look like? Are they big? Are they small? And how are they activating people to get involved? Sharon, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, of course, uh, we all have heard about Line 3, and those efforts, went on for years, and still the pipeline went through. And now today we know that there were about 28 uh, breaches already on Line 3. So that many people were involved in that. Um, I just want to go back to the previous question a minute and just say that racism. Um, uh, the Hennepin County commissioner said last year, or the year before, Angela Connolly started introduced a resolution that racism is a public health issue, and Governor Walz a year ago said, um, Minnesota is the most wonderful place to live in for education if you're white, and for healthcare, number one state if you're white, but if you're a person of color, it's the worst place. And so there are all these effects on us in terms of the health disparities that we deal with. And so and the climate itself, uh, 2 years ago we had so much water, so much rain in the spring that squash crops were affected all over the state. Everyone lost their squash because of mold. Then last year we had a drought, and so these extremes in the temperature affect our food sources. Wild rice, which is a sacred food for us. It all depends on the weather, and so if there's too much rain, you're not going to have a good wild rice crop. And if it's too dry, you're also not going to have a good wild rice crop. And again, what they're doing with the pipelines are also affecting. They dewatered. I don't know how many lakes and streams last year to make that pipeline. And then again, people south of us are dealing with. Uh, they cannot give babies water from their wells because of the effects of pollution in the water. Uh, because there's so much fertilizer, and 10,000 tons of fertilizer are emptied into the Minnesota River Valley every year. And then you have the tile drainings, and the rains come that washes it all downstream. And so then people in Hastings and Red Wing and further on down, cannot give that water, their well water, to their babies. So there's so many effects of climate change. And I served on the Clean Water Council for 3 years, and I kept asking, when are we going to ask farmers to plan for 25 years from now or sooner, when Minnesota actually has to feed the world, because of climate change? And nobody ever answers that question.
But you're bringing up a really good point. I think more and more, even if you're casually following, environmentalism and climate change, we are hearing Minnesota come up in the conversation more and more, put on list of what will be the most hospitable places to live in the future, and what will be the ideal place to move in the next 10, 20, 30 years. But that means that we do have to address the things that are happening here now, and we do have to be aware of what's happening here now, not just for ourselves, but for the changes that are going to come to everyone. Sharon, that actually brings up a really good question, because you brought up, like some of like what happens with farmers and how some of the facilities in different areas are causing some of these problems. What should be done about facilities that cause pollution that's located near like low income communities or communities of color? Like, for example, the community members that want to get rid of a garbage incinerator in Minneapolis. It's the Hennepin Energy Recovery Center, or HERC. What are the solutions that we can think of to address, these organizations or industries or companies that are creating these problems?
Winona LaDuke always says, uh, she always puts it this way, when her children were young, little, she would tell them, um, you can't go make another mess until you clean up this mess right here. And I think, it's simple. We need to hold the point sources of polluters. Uh, we need to hold them accountable and have them clean up their messes. Usually it's the public, we taxpayers, who have to clean up the messes. And so, in Phillips' neighborhood, we've been the target of everything that could be wrong, right? We had the arsenic, we had the plant that spread arsenic all over the ground in this community. The winds came and blew it, and then then they wanted to put that garbage burner here, and now we're fighting over the roof depot area. Community people want to have gardens there. They want to have uh, community art centers there. They want all these things, and in the city wanted to put all of their diesel burning water trucks there, and now they're saying, well, you can have it, but you have to pay for you have to pay the millions of dollars that we put into it in order to get it. So and it just contributes to the inequality of what we're doing. But I think, hold those people responsible. And that's one of the problems with the Clean Water Act is farmers were exempted from that point source of pollution. And so they can just continue to do what they do. And, and they always say, like, well, we were exempt because we feed the world. And yet we know in Minnesota, only 93% of all the crops are for food. The rest is biofuel and cattle feed. And so some of those sort of the 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 the, the myths or the lies, as I say, that continue over and over and over again really need to be addressed and called out for what they are and change those policies. We have to change policies. Thanks.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. T, talk to me a little bit about that, because your organization is in a position to, when you're talking about accountability, how do you position an organization like Minnesota 350 to be able to help create some of that public accountability?
Yeah, MN 350, we have an amazing staff team, and we're out there and we're meeting with the community. So we're hearing what the community want us to push. And so we have a policy action team, and that policy action team will hear some of the issues that people are talking about. And they then will generate calls and emails and editorials and ask people to talk to their elected officials about policies and things that they want to see done. And we push that. Many of us on the staff team are also politically involved ourselves. We are delegates, we are make sure that we are also in our own community having conversations and talking about climate and what is a plan for our elected officials who run on a climate campaign. And then when they get in office, then we want to, make sure that they say that they're going to do the things that they are going to do. We have a Green New Deal that talks about jobs, creating green energy jobs. So our team is out there having conversations with people. And what does right now, the Green New Deal has a people equity and a people's climate and equity plan that they're working on. And to Sharon's point, our MN350 is doing work with our pipeline resistance team, who's doing work with our encampment and the Enbridge pipeline network. We have our transit justice team, who is also talking about electronic bus vehicles. And our amazing communications team. So I think that part of climate, you can't talk about climate. Even in my new role, I get asked often, how's the job going? And that's my opportunity now to have conversations about, well, climate, because I'm learning. I understand I come from a healthcare and a community engagement background, but I think everything we talk about has to do with climate. And so I think that if people want to get involved and want to help their fellow peers in the community, then it's about having conversations and because when you think about climate, it's so big and it's so broad, it's just not one thing. And I just recently was having a conversation with my youngest son, and he was like, "So, yeah, you're talking about climate." And we talked about it from his asthma, and then we talked about it from jobs, and we talked about transit, so we was able to have that conversation. And I think by having that conversation with him, then I got him engaged. And it's not that I'm trying to change people's mind, but to at least get them to think differently about climate. So I think these are the things that we can do. Because MN350, I would just say we have a broad range of things that we're doing. And we always say to people, if you want to get involved, go to our website. And we have an amazing volunteer base who's out there as well, working alongside with our staff and asking the community what is it that they want to see. And those things that they tell us that they want to see, then we then push our elected officials to do those things.
And that it's going to take, I think the one thing that's clear, it's going to take all of us to actually work together to do some of this.
It is. We all have to talk about it. Yeah.
So prior to this event, NPR's community engagement team hosted a series of story circles with environmental leaders and activists in Minnesota. And it was rich and personal and often vulnerable in the nature of the discussion. I want to play a little piece from the story circle, one of the story circle participants. Her name was May Yang Lee. She's a Hmong artist and an activist who lives here in St. Paul. And she had this to say.
So I always think about how do we create equity in these spaces so everyone is aware of what's happening, and there are multiple ways to solve this issue or fight the system. And if we're solving these issues, then what are some sacrifices we are going to have to make within our routine? And if we're fighting the systems, what do we need to be aware about the issues? Also know about your rights. We have to start from somewhere. Even though it seems like a gloomy future, I think it's important that we recognize that we have to work together and support one another.
I think that sums up really beautifully a little bit of what Sharon has been saying and a little bit of what Tia has been saying. And ultimately, it sounds like we have some real responsibility in helping to repair the harm. Francisco, can you talk a little bit about how that translates to your work and the work that Kopal does?
Yes, thank you. Kopal has been one of the organizations with Minnesota 350 and others as well that have worked with elected officials and introduced a bill that is called the Frontline Communities Protection Act, which is HF 3146, again, HF 3146. And you can visit our website and get to know more details. But one of the beautiful things about this bill, it's a bill and now it's in the omnibus bill, so it's being discussed. So the idea is to establish what we call environmental justice areas. So an environmental justice area is an area that is going to be defined by the PUC, that is going to include demographic information, social and economic information about the people that lives in an environmental justice selected area. And the idea is to that by understanding who resides over there and what are the conditions of the communities that resides in this designated area, when the PCA, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, will have the power to deny or modify permits for facilities that contribute to add additional pollution to the designated area. So in this way, what we hope is that through this bill, we can have more protection for communities that needs protection, and also work with companies that are probably contributing in a high level to impact our communities. So that is one area in which we are working. And so anyone, the listeners, anyone can just visit our website, and there are many different ways in which people can participate.
I think that's really interesting, because I think sometimes we think on a common sense level that you wouldn't need a law like that to exist. You would think you would just be able to turn down or deny a permit based on creating further harm or further impact. And I think sometimes we lose track of or lose sight of just how complex the issues are, and just sort of how many sort of loopholes and spaces in the law exist currently. we have some questions from our participants, and we also have some questions from our viewers. So I want to make sure that we're pulling some folks in. There's a question here from Todd Burlett. He asks about light pollution. He says light pollution sits at the intersection of human health and wellness, economic costs, and climate change. Its health impacts cancer, diabetes, obesity, and low birth rate, and 35% of our lighting bill is wasted, increasing costs to families and increasing our use of fossil fuels. Are you panelists familiar with the impacts? And if so, how are you working to help mitigate the impact of this particular type of pollution and to your communities?
I think that's a great question, and I would just respond by saying it's about conversations. Yes, I do agree with your statement about am I aware about cancer and how that's impacting. It's all part of the environment. So yes, I do agree with your observation, especially working in an emergency room for 20 plus years. I would absolutely agree with that comment, and I think there's a lot of initiatives that we can do. But I think the most important right now is having conversations. You have to have conversations, and then some of the solutions can be some simple things that we can put in. If someone is dealing with some health disparity, making sure that they have the resources that they need to be able to. I think I heard my fellow panelist Sharon talk about how she's dealing with asthma now and it's controlled. I think that's important. Her asthma is now controlled. So you have people who are having the impacts of facing some of the impacts from climate. And if they don't have the resources that they need, then their conditions are just going to continue to exacerbate. And so I think that providing the resources out in the community, so how you disseminate information and that you're disseminating that information verbally and email and text and media like we're doing right now with NPR, having these conversations and then providing resources that people can go to help deal with some of the issues that they have. But then I also think it's a call to action as well. Having people get involved. And they may say, well, how can I get involved? It could just mean a phone call to your elected officials. It could mean joining a volunteer group who's out there talking to transit workers about costs or how much it costs in air pollution, having conversations with your fellow person. That's my contribution to your question.
Okay, I was going to ask if anybody else wanted to weigh in on that particular question. I'm going to make sure I give you the floor.
I can add, when we look at the polluters, oftentimes the polluters and major levels are going to be corporations that pour into the environment the pollutants that make us sick. So going back to Central America, for instance, Central America produces, it pollutes, but the amount is very minor in comparison to nations, here in the United States, the way that we consume and contribute to the pollution. But also, when we look within the United States and what is the impact of our low-income communities into what we pollute is pretty minor. But when we look at the consequences of how corporations are polluting our environment is huge, especially in our low-income communities. So in a way, I think we need to look into what are the elements that we as consumers uses or how these corporations are putting into the economy things that are not good for our collective good. For instance, how do we produce energy? I mean, a few minutes ago, we spoke about the incinerator, which is located in downtown Minneapolis, but also has been impacting North Minneapolis. And so the incinerator that we have right in downtown, it produces energy. And so when you go through the airport, you will see garbage to energy. You will see that green label that it makes us feel good. Hey, we are burning the garbage to generate energy. However, when that garbage is burned, the particles that are thrown into the air goes into the lungs of the people who lives or resides in those areas. So in a way, we need to stop and say, hey, wait, how do we produce energy? Is the energy that we enjoy by turning the lights on also killing us because of the way that we produce that? So I think it requires to all of us in the society, elected officials, us, companies as well, to rethink how we do that, because otherwise we are just killing ourselves by consuming the very same things that are so essential for our lives.
Now, that actually brings up a really great question that just came from an audience member. I feel like it connects. This audience member said that clearly there are ongoing harms on how we handle our water, our air, and our waste. Are any of the solutions to past environmental harms financially viable right now?
If you allow me to, this bill that we have been supporting, it basically requires between six to $10 million to get the tools that the PUC will need to assess communities. Now, that is just an assessment of how communities are impacted and what level of recommendations PUC can make to companies that are polluting the air. I mean, Minnesota has the 2050, I think it's the 2050 plan, which is basically transform how energy is being produced. And that, when we look at the full scope of these, basically what we're looking at is how, for instance, Minnesota can invest in solar panels and other means of energy that protects our environment, protects everyone. And so those are some of the things, key conversations that I think we got to have, and how the state is going to be able to transform to be able to have an state that is equal to everyone, as Sharon pointed out, because right now, Minnesota is beautiful, but obviously the consequences, the burden of how is being taken on some communities of color and indigenous communities.
That actually gives me a really good segue into an additional question. We have a question from Kermit Hovey, who asked, what are your thoughts about how environmental and climate action groups, many of which tend to be majority white, can be more inclusive and collaborative with BIPOC individuals, communities, and groups? Sharon, you look, you have something to say.
Well, that's really a question for those environmental groups, right? Like, that's on them. How did they become more inclusive? I can say this, like, in terms of, on the water walks, everybody's a volunteer, including myself, and so we invite everybody to participate. And it doesn't matter whether you're a millionaire or a 16-year-old. Everybody walks when it's their turn. Everybody participates in fixing lunches or whatever the work that has to be done. So it really builds community. So it builds community as we're going, and I think like, we're very inclusive. But then that brings up the question of, like, resources, right? Which organizations are resourced and how are they resourced? All the work that the Water Walks do, it's all volunteer and all volunteer donations. But then you look at some of the environmental groups, and let's put it out there, like, I'm sure this doesn't apply to you, T, but so the head of some of these environmental groups, their salary is pretty incredible. And so how are people of color led organizations working for the environment resourced as opposed to some of the more mainstream? And then I think too, like, what is our philosophy, right? So we believe, like, the spirit should be at the center of everything. We look at water as having a spirit. We look at the earth as being a living entity that we're the stewards of. The stewards to take care of it so that future generations have a habitable planet. We don't look at water as being, H2O. hydrogen and 2 parts oxygen. We look at it as being a living entity. And I think those are big, big fundamental differences. So that really even then get to, who's doing the work, how's it being done, and what are the plans for the future.
Then if I can add, Twila, a
Yeah,
little
please.
bit. I think the question was how to get more communities of color engaged. Was that the question?
Yeah, how you get more
Um,
people to come.
At MN 350, we are aware that the climate movement has been a white movement, but I do think I think the climate movement is aware of that now. I think that that's one of the things that they know, because historically they've been talking to the same crowd, and we're not going to win the climate movement with the same people. I think I said that earlier. And so I always say to my white counterparts, if you're in an environment and you look around the room, and if everyone looks like you, then that means that you got some work to do. You have to be bold, you have to be unapologetic and go out there and have those conversations and put some initiatives in place, some intentional initiatives in place that's going to bring in more BIPOC community. And I would just say not just BIPOC, but our non-English speaking communities as well, our low income communities. And you got to find out what the issues are that they're dealing with, because it's environmental justice, social justice, climate justice, all is the same thing. We're all singing the same song. And so you have to be intentional in how you are, what audience you're trying to attract. And when I think about our Green New Deal work and the work that we're doing at MN 350, we are intentional about, we recognize that we have a large a large volunteer base, and we're intentional about continuing to grow our volunteer base with communities of color and going out and being intentional, just simply asking them to get involved. What are the issues that's affecting you most, by just simply asking them, can you get involved? And if they say no, then we need to find out what's limiting them from getting involved. Is it time? Maybe we need to change the time of day we're having a meeting. If they don't have computer access, maybe we need to just do a phone call. Different ways. Maybe we can meet at a coffee shop outside in the park. And so we have to meet people where they're at if we really want to be inclusive.
Twila, can I?
Yeah, please.
One more thing. So, I really encourage the viewers and the listeners, to go to some of the Minnesota environmental groups. Go to their websites, take a look at who's on their board, who's on their staff, who are their major key staff. And I think you'll not be surprised that they're almost exclusively white folks. And, it's not up to us as people of color to like invite ourselves into those organizations, like they need to do some outreach, and I tell people, if you go into a room, and especially if you go over in St. Paul at the Capitol and any of those, like I said, I served on the Clean Water Council. There's me and one other person. We're out of 30 people of color. If you go in a room and everybody looks exactly like you, and there are no people of color there's something wrong. And it's not up to us to fix that. It's up to you. So I tell people, like white folks, like if you don't know any people of color, go make a friend. Go find somebody. Find somebody who'll be honest with you. Go volunteer in one of our organizations. It's not up to us to like fix your diversity problem.
I don't think I could say it any better, right? Francisco, go ahead. You have something.
Yeah, pretty quick. One of the things is about investment in our infrastructures. So I mentioned that Kopal has been like second or third year into these conversations. It doesn't mean that we were not concerned about environment as individuals, as community. But the thing is that for many, many generations, there hasn't been any investment into BIPOC and Indigenous communities in what relates to environmental justice. And in fact, communities of color are the ones who introduced the concept of environmental justice, when previously environment was seen as the beautiful place without humans that white people, middle class, will go and enjoy. It was our movement that introduced the idea of humans in relationship to that environment and the need of, and then the element of justice. So when we look at that, this investment in our communities, what generates is that our communities are not fully present in some key conversations that impacts every one of us, and mostly, again, communities of color. So my point will be keep investing in the various communities, in the various environmental justice organizations led by people of color. Keep investing in the development of our young people as well, because we really need to have see more resources into our community so we can keep fighting for a environment that is going to be good for all of us.
I think that's everything you've said in the last 10 minutes, I just want to jump up and just keep yelling cosign. I agree. Before we close out the session today, I want to make sure that I give you an opportunity to share with our audience how they can support your work, because I think what you're all doing is amazing, and I want to make sure that we give people the ability to sort of take action and support what you do. So T, can you tell us how can we continue to support your work?
Yeah, I would encourage the viewers to go to our website, mn350.org. And if you go to our website, you'll see a list of the great work that our staff and volunteers are doing in the state of Minnesota. Not just in Minneapolis, but I mean, up in Bemidji, we have our Bemidji 350 organization. That's our indigenous group. And so we have a lot of things that you can get involved in. And so mn350.org, and then there's a volunteer click. So that's how you can get involved.
Thank you. Francisco, how can we support your work?
Yes, I'm going to steal something from, shouldn't say steal, I guess. I want to reuse our statement from indigenous communities from Mexico. They said, we need to build a world where many worlds can fit. And so with these, I believe that at Kopal, we welcome anyone because we need those people who knows how to do research, how to do public policy, how to do organizing. So please check us out, kopalmn.org, and reach out to us and let us know how you want to participate, and we will have enough space for you as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Sharon, how can we support your work?
Yeah, so people can go to our website, Indigenous Peoples Task Force. You can also go to NIBIWalk, NIBIWalk.org, and that has information about upcoming walks and things that we're doing. But I also want to say something about, because I talking about the farmers. I think the farmers also the farm to table movement is really where it's at. As we begin to grow our own food in small, not the big commercial farms, but there's so many farmers who are doing regenerative farming, and I have a farm, and so I just want to say support those farm to table movements. Thank you.
Absolutely, and thank you all for your contribution. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for being advocates and being voices and being on the front lines. And thank you all who are a part of the audience who are spending your lunch hour with us today. Here's a reminder that this conversation will be broadcast on NPR News tomorrow at 9 a.m. And save the date for our next In Focus virtual conversation. It's coming up on June 29th, and we hope to see you there. Until then, I'm Twila Dang. This was In Focus, and thank you. Be safe and stay well.